Hey guys, it's Thorin, also known as 944. Don't forget Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Zonic, who was obviously the very famous coach of Astralis, but is now the coach of Team Falcons, which maybe we'll talk about at the end of the interview. So Zonic, the first place I want to actually start, as always, with all the really old school players, is obviously in 1.6, but I actually want to start on a note that feels like there's a really weird angle to your career, mate. I feel like because you became a coach and you had so much success coaching, like, I know the joke is, even though Ave was in CSGO, people seem to think you were like the IGL of all the teams in 1.6. I noticed they just sort of assume that, like, in the same way as God B and them are around now. So my question is this, actually. Did you ever actually in-game lead in 1.6? Or were you ever the in-game leader of any of your teams? Or a secondary caller, or what? What was the situation?
I think I've always been a secondary caller, but I think for me it was, I tried taking up the task a few times, but it was one of those classic situations where you picked it up, you tried it for 1 month or 2 months, and then you initially got tired of your teammates not listening, and you could definitely see how
Sure.
how big of a job that how big of the task the game leader actually has, and yeah, then I felt like my individual level was probably at that time a bit too good for me to IGL, so it was handed back to Ave and some of the others IGLs who I took it from.
Because that's the other aspect I want to ask about, essentially to help characterize who was Zonic, the 1.6 player. Because the other angle I would ask is this. Even when people remember you in 1.6, they probably just remember mTw at the end. And in that team, actually, because you had people like Sunde and Trace and some like insane players, actually you weren't even necessarily known as like the start at the time. But I remember early in your career, you were one of like the rising talents in Denmark. In those early teams, you were the one who would have all the frags, right? Did you think of yourself? Obviously, these terms are all very loose. Were you like a star player? Were you a fragger back in the day?
I think back then you never really I think nowadays you really pinpoint, the positions, and you figure out, okay, who are we gonna set this game around, our playbook. I think it was a bit more random back then. It was just basically who was top of the scoreboard, who had good ideas, and who was good with the communication and all these things. And I think I automatically got it just because I was fracking more, than the rest of the squad. And then obviously, as you said, Sunde came in, and then later on Trace. And I think it was a mix of them coming in being extremely sharp, and also for me to take on a different role. I was helping a lot with the IGLing, secondary caller, rotation, making sure we had a good overview of the strat, helping with the mid-round calling. And then, yeah, I think it was, there was nothing like really set in stone, like, okay, now Sunde is coming in, we really need to, focus on building up our playbook around him. It was just him, playing extremely good, and me maybe taking a step back to focus more on the strategic side of things.
Right, one team I want to ask you about, it's probably one that you never talk about in the interviews, which is actually back in 2005, they had a team, and there's a little bit of a backstory to this. So at the time, people will know famously, SK Gaming was always Swedish, but then because they had that year where the players went and they went to do a super team in NIP and eventually came back later, they actually went with the Danish team at the time, which was basically the core of the team that was the Titans before. It was really good the previous year, won ESWC. And then I remember what happened was the initial lineup they had was like almost the Titans, it was like maybe like one player off. And then I remember they just had an issue where someone like couldn't play and they needed a stand-in. And initially you just came in as a stand-in, right? Even though you actually played with them later and got to the final of the major and stuff at the ESWC. So can you give me some backstory on this? Was this really just like a call-up because you knew a player or something? Were you actually fully in the team at some point in time? What was the story?
So I remember I always had a really good relationship with WEMP. Me and him and I really wanted to play together at some point. And I remember Drali, the Danish player, he was not really disciplined. He didn't really show up on time. He at some point he also lied about his internet being down, so that the teammates, they called the provider to actually ask if there was something going on.
That's pretty hardcore. Okay, fair enough.
And he got busted. And I think it started out with me being a stand-in at the CPL Barcelona in 2005. And we did horrendous, but I think me individually did very well. And I think they could see, this young up-and-coming player who was extremely motivated to play. And it was just, I really wanted to, play. I was getting into to a certain point in life where, the whole thing about playing without getting a salary and whether I should take my education or not. It was just a good opportunity for me to join SK, to get those $500-600 per month, which was the level of salary back then.
Sure.
I played as a stand-in. And I remember after that, WEMP contacted me saying that the team wanted to continue a little bit with Rally, but that was only for a short period of time. And then they decided, okay, we need to get Danny. I joined. I told my teammates MJE and HBX that, and it was basically, I mean, obviously, that the travel was a big thing, because back then the whole goal was just to, travel around the world, get to see the world. That was one of the big motivational factors for a CS player back then. And I needed a new PC, and I couldn't afford it. And joining SK, you got a PC and you got some salary. So it was also, one of the part of my decision. It was a tough, except for the ESWC one. I think we performed really poorly. And I remember after ESWC, I told the guys that, hey, let's go back and start practicing on Monday, and they were like, no, let's just take 2 or 3 weeks off. And I remember, I think it was the World Cyber Games qualification or something else that was coming up, and I remember we lost because people they were not motivated. And also there was an episode before the final. Eugene, one of the players, were back then you were sharing rooms, so it was me, Eugene, and WEMP who was on in the same room. And I remember he was missing the night before, and I think he went out. I don't know if he was partying or not, but me and WEMP didn't have access to the hotel room, so we had to actually share the room with my former team, which was Clan IT. Was called. So we had to share a room with HBX and NG and those guys. And there was no it was not a fancy hotel, so there was no lobby, there was no workers there. Yeah, you just got a shitty hotel, and so we had to spend sharing the rooms. And I remember the Clan IT guys were super cool. They slept on the floor while we could get to bed. So fair enough. So we were ready for the final against Complexity, but yeah, it turned out really wrong, and we found out that he was partying or with a girl. I can't remember actually, and that was just it was a tipping point. And then I remember calling Alex Müller, the CEO of SK, and I said that I wanted to leave again. After staying for 4 or 5 months, I wanted to go back to Clan IT. And then I think he wrote an email saying that he's going to shut down the whole Danish division. And that was that.
By the way, along these lines, I think one thing that will probably shock people, in fact, it's partly because of your Astralis team. Everyone has a vision now, Zonic, that like Danes are like the ultimate esports athletes. They're professionals, like soccer, you have your water, you go to bed. Like, it sounds like the scene was pretty wild back then if everyone's just going bloody drinking and lying about being online and stuff. Like, was it very amateurish back then?
I think not until NTW. I think in NTW, some of the things that, working with Astralis, working with Vitality, having Lars, our sports psychologists, a lot of the things that we did in MTW, we were being taught in Astralis, how to work as a team, how to, provide this transparency within the team, being an open, the whole structure around the team. We had a really strong connection in MTW, I would say. We were not the best players. We didn't have the best players. You had Forrest Get Right and, the whole Navi squad, the Polish guys as well. We didn't have that much firepower, I would say, but we definitely had the team. And I think some of the things that we did, I was taught that in Astralis as well. It's like, holy shit. And I had talks with Dave and WEMP, about it later on. WEMP working in North and Dave being a coach as well, that a lot of the things that we did back then was actually quite a step ahead compared to how things usually were. But I think in Danish CS has always been known for our tactical approach, by the fact, as I said before, that we didn't have the best players, but we were still super unprofessional when it came to partying, and during the summer people just stopped playing, and then they came back during the winter again. And World of Warcraft also was cancelled to classic. That was cancelled to 1.6 as well at some point. So yeah, but I guess in HW we were at least a couple of steps ahead, I think.
Right, it's funny because it's a similar story. When you had WEMP later in MTW, that was also where he sort of transitioned out of being like the super duper star player and looked like he more was about the team and stuff. In SK, that was still like the prime WEMP, right? This is when he was like a phenom, and he was like a prodigy at Counter-Strike, right?
He was. He was an extremely talented player, but even better, he was like such a good person. Right. Compared to his level, he was a really nice guy. Still to this day, one of my favorite teammates. he was just a nice to hang around with. He was never, despite him being an important piece of the puzzle, he was never demanding. Everyone loved WEMP, and yeah, he was a really easygoing, but also an insane aim, and good with communication. Always happy.
As you pointed out, a couple of the people you were always around in these early teams that eventually became NoA and mTw was obviously HPX, the AWPer, if people remember, and then MG, who, I mean, I know this, he was like a small site anchor, but no one else is going to know that reference. I don't know I included that, right? These guys were obviously around for years and years and became part of what eventually became mTw. Obviously, HPX got swapped out. Were these always friends of yours? Did you just have a good vibe with them? Why are these players like keeping and coming back into the cycle with Zonic throughout the years?
I think my career started before theirs. I mean, they were like an up-and-coming team in Denmark. We had this group called Starter Mafia. It was like a closed, back then you didn't have Faceit or whatever. So it was like a closed circle for professional, or not professional, but good Danish players. And it was a closed circle, and they didn't really want to invite. I didn't like the way they approached the scene. You had players who really never played top CS, but they were like good friends with each other, and they were like the ones being the gatekeepers of this group. They wouldn't allow, MG.
And was it like a pub group or something? What is it like? You're doing pugs or pickups and 10-mans and stuff, right?
Yes, exactly. And they were just treating, the up and coming talents, and I think they actually were hindering the Danish scene of, progressing. We always had this, battle against Swedish Counter-Strike, which I felt we lost for like 10 years in a row, and then we suddenly had an opportunity later on, but I just felt this group was really bad for the development of Danish CS players. So one day I just stepped out of it, like being probably one of the biggest prospect of Danish CS. I just stepped out of it and I joined the guys with MG and HPX. I think it was called Fade to Black. It was one of the teams back then. So I was this big talent coming in, an established name in Danish Counter-Strike, taking on these young guns. And I mean, to this day, we all have kids. We see each other on a regular basis during, the summer vacation. We missed it this year, but last year we all rented a summer house, and we brought all our families, and we stayed together. Unfortunately, WEMP lives in Germany right now, so. Right. Working with Epic Games, so he was not there, but we tried to see each other, and it was just a couple of weeks ago where I had MG and his wife and kids here in my house.
Because one thing I've got to ask you about, since as you say back then, like I always used to describe it like this, the joke is, unless you win the World Cyber Games, the real prize of the World Cyber Games is to get to go to the World Cyber Games, because it's often in like China or America or Korea. And so, like you say, to travel was actually a big like appeal of it. And one of the events you got to go to in this same year was you went to that it wasn't the first season, you went to that World Esports Games one, the one where you go and you live in like, I think it was China, I think it was Korea at the time. It was still South Korea, right? You go to, but it's the one where you go for like weeks and weeks, and there's obviously different from, if people don't know, back then all tournaments take place for like 3 days back then. It was like very, very short. So this was like the opposite approach. It was almost like E-League, basically, if people can know the modern analogy, right? But I remember the one you went to was one of the ones where, here's the question I have though, which is, was it just like the contrast to being in such a different circumstance? Because I know a lot of the Western teams actually had underwhelming results, and at the same time, famously, the Chinese team, WNV, and the Korean team, Project, they were like seemingly just like 5 times better when they played in these tournaments than any of the tournaments. So, one, were the tournaments legit? Like, do you think they were like, I don't know, that home field advantage? Could they hear the commentators or something? And then 2, what was the experience like for you guys? I mean, you didn't do well at it, but it must have been crazy to go to like Korea in like 2005, right?
I was crazy. It was still one of my best experiences, and I remember, all our families was with us in the airport, sharing our goodbyes. MG was in high school, and his parents were like, they're from Lebanon, and education is really high on their priority, for the kids, and they were like furious with him going to South Korea. But he got it approved by the school, and they wished him best of luck, but it was, we were so young and inexperienced. But, to answer your questions, I think I was really impressed by especially WNV. I think the way they played the game tactically was something I really got inspired outside. Maybe, it was not that professional, so maybe they could hear the commentators. I don't know. But I definitely felt that they were, a step ahead, tactically than some of the other teams back then. And I think, the whole Project Korea with Solo, I think they just overperformed, playing in front of the home crowd. If there was a crowd, I think it was just a studio.
It was in a TV studio or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but just, and it was also the first time where I remember we had a practice room. It was the first time. So practice room actually existed in 2005.
True.
And we had these, it was not CRT monitors. It was the flat screens, and it was 60 hertz.
Oh, that's when they were really bad, right? They weren't very good at the time, right?
And I remember me, HBX, and MJ, we went to a shopping mall to get to see if we could buy someone. But for, South Korea being, ahead technology-wise, it was difficult to get a CRT monitor because everyone was not selling them anymore. So I remember we went to a shopping mall, and, in a clothing store behind the office, there was this, CRT monitor. And we went in, and they said, "Okay, what clothes do you want?" No, we don't want any clothes. We just want the 3 CRT monitors.
Oh, as in they were like in the window or something, right?
Yeah, so now it was in the back.
Right, it wasn't an actual product they were selling in theory, right?
It was like it was just playing, selling shoes or whatever, like a Foot Locker. Just go in. Hey, in the back we can see there is a CRT monitor. We just want that, and they said it's not for sale. And then I think we handed over almost all our money just to get it. And then he eventually sold it, and we brought it back to the practice room where we were playing there. And then we just. We went. You took the shuttle. We went to the studio. We played our game. We went back to the hotel where we could see our game in national television when we got back home, and it was just a phenomenal experience. Super nervous, playing. We had all these big teams with NIP, Wally. I remember you had the Asian teams where WNV. I must have said I was scared about those guys. I was really admiring them the way they played. And we just really couldn't, I was not having a good tournament, if I remember correctly. You had so much time, so I decided to play all the time, and it was just bad for me.
One thing that's funny is when I say, if we talk now about when you were in the NoA team that became MTW later, I always feel like people forget the origin story, how you got in this team, because it's so bizarre. Before this, the team famously, obviously Executor was a member when they had the proper international lineup with Shagwan, all those guys. But this is years after that, and it's when he'd had a lineup that was like Norwegian and Swedes, and then he did this mad one for this year when you came in, where it was like Norwegians and Danes, and there's an interesting detail a lot of Westerners don't know, which is, as far as I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, Norwegians, if they wrote down what they were saying, Danish people would understand them. But it's like the Danish people, if you're both speaking, one of you doesn't understand the other or something. So how did that work? Like in theory, did you just speak in Danish in the team? Did it work in that sense?
So I think Norwegians and Swedish people have really a hard time understanding Danish guys.
Right.
Norwegian and Danish, written language is somewhat similar. Sometimes I can't even tell the difference.
Right.
We had no issues whatsoever understanding each other. I think there is some, because I had difficulties understanding BSL, for example, but I had no issues understanding Executor, Lassa and PRB. So that was just, I think it just took a couple of months, and then we pretty much understood each other. So that was not an issue whatsoever.
Was that a strange project? I mean, I know it only lasted like a few months and it just became a Danish team eventually, but it was an interesting idea. I mean, at the time, if people don't know, Executor was like a legendary figure at the time, right?
Yeah, I remember we were sitting at it was not a boot camp, but we were sitting LAN, I think, me and HBX, and he was actually the one getting the offer. Right. I can't remember if it was together with me or if he demanded that I come with him. I can't remember, to be honest, but one thing is that I told him that I didn't necessarily wanted to leave Asylum, with MJ, Galahad, and Bloody. But if he wanted to go for it, I would be happy to continue playing with him. So it was pretty much his decision, and we decided to go. And again, we came from one team where we didn't get a salary to a team where we got salary, and yeah, it was not the best project. I would say we won SHG Open, I think, the Danish
tournament. Yeah,
we played, I think, a Finnish team or FNATIC in the final. I can't remember. But yeah, it was a tough period, and eventually we took over the team in some sense and made it full Danish after some time.
By the way, a player I do want to ask about, because obviously as the story goes on, he eventually docks out when you came with the lineup with WEMP and it became mTw and all the success. I always thought the player that got hard done by was the guy at HBX who we're talking about, because if people don't know, I remember watching a bunch of his POV demos. He was actually a very good AWPer. Like, yeah, he was like the traditional style of AWPer. Like, you sit him on a spot, they kill everyone who comes in the angle. You take take the mid CT angle on Dust 2, for example. Like, all the classic spots. Like, you played with him for a while. Was there a reason he didn't get to go on with you guys later into the mTw project, or was he not as interested? What was the vibe? Because I always thought it was kind of like a lost talent, right?
Both yes and no. I think time caught up with him at some point. You had Sunde. He was actually a rifler back when we had him in the beginning. And every time he took the AWP or had it as a secondary AWP, he really showed potential. And I think it all started. I guess I can say that now. It all started with an episode on Train. Me and MG, I was always the rotation, and MG was anchoring in on Train. And you had Sunde, HBX, and AF outside. And I would just remember one day where AF and Sunde was writing to me on Steam saying that no more, we don't want to play with him anymore. And I was like, what the hell? And we had a meeting afterwards, and it was because I think HBX was behind Bomb Train. They smoked out outside, and there was like a lot of noise outside, and he was just like, I'm going to go in. Instead of fighting with his teammates. Okay. And I think that was just an episode where they just had enough. And as I also said before, I really wanted to play with WEMP, and for me to play with him again was just a good opportunity. And I remember throughout, I think maybe a year two after, HBX also came and said it was the right decision you guys made, but it was definitely difficult kicking one of your best friends outside of the game as well. But I think it had to be done, and that was something necessary, and a little bit like similar to when I benched Dupree, in Vitality. It is tough. It is a really tough decision to make, but in the end, it just makes you want to prove that it was the right decision afterwards, so that they actually come back. That is the ultimate goal. That you have a talk with them later on, and they come to you and they say, okay, that was the right call you made.
Because obviously before you made the mTw team and brought WEMP in, you guys were like this close already when you had HBX and Sunde was the rifler. Because you had the ESWC final, obviously, that you lost to the Poles. That was the one where, like, if people don't know, if they didn't watch 1.6, those Polish guys were just like 1.5 times better when it was a major final somehow. Like on a normal day, they would even just lose the next tournament to fifth best team or something. And then the other one, obviously the nightmare one, was the emulate one, because on paper, that's one of those ones where, how brackets work. You're supposed to think, I've already won when you make the final, aren't you? Like they were nobody at the time. They were never going to win the tournament. So when you look back on these two, these could have both been wins, right? You could have had 2 majors that year.
It's both yes and no. I think actually we deserved to lose, both games. I think we were just... Okay. I remember losing on Train against the Polish guys. No questions about that. That we should definitely lose that 10 out of 10 times. I think Nuke got really close, if I remember correctly. Also a game that we could have lost. We won in overtime. And then on Inferno, you had this Neo 1-on-2.
Sure.
I remember on TeamSpeak, one of them saying, he's saving. I think it was in A, and he just started peeking, and I got so frustrated. Yes. Against Emulate, yes, on paper, we should definitely win that game. And just not a lot of people know, but Matt was my assistant coach in Vitality.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Does he bring that up then?
He brought it up a lot of times.
There you go.
Yes. But actually, mostly the French players, they brought it up. It was actually not that much Matt. Okay. But that was a game on paper we should definitely win. But they were just destroying us. I remember, MSX, if I remember correctly, he was having a good game. And they were just dominating us. But it just felt like they had this one run, Emulate, and then they pretty much fell off afterwards. But yeah, we had no business winning either of those 2 finals, especially one against Emulate.
Since this is so much earlier in your career, how do you handle if you lose a massive final? Like, you'd been in a bunch at this point. You'd been in the SK1, a couple of these. What happens after you lose a big final? Is it not a big deal? Do you forget about it? Would it stay with you? Would it haunt you at all?
It haunts me a lot. In the first couple of hours is always like really tough. And then you get this, redemption where you're like, oh yeah, but now you need to figure out what you need to work on, and you get a little bit motivated again, and you I'd like to use my teammates, at least when I was a player, to not just sit alone in my hotel room. And then you get these, I would say, clusters of full tilt mode again that comes. So you can sit in the evening, you just had dinner with the team, there's a little bit of good vibe, and then you remind yourself that you just lost a big fucking final, and then you get full tilted again for like 10-15 minutes, and then you're back, and that goes on, and then time heals everything, and yeah, it just becomes better day by day. But I've definitely lost. I would say mostly as a player, I've lost a lot of big finals, but I've been blessed as a coach, I think, in not losing too many big finals, fortunately.
Sure. I mean, luckily at this point in the interview, we're about to talk about 2008, which is the awesome year in 1.6 where it all goes great. So obviously it did begin, as like I referred to earlier, by getting WEMP in. But the interesting thing is, this is obviously a very different team from when you played together at SK. Like, who do you think WEMP was at this point in his career? Like, I know he was still young because the joke is, he's not that old now if people don't know. He really was like a super prodigy in 1.6. But was he already someone like who matured in his career? Because he seemed at the time, like I say, like he was more about team play and like trying to like work with the core unit, as it were, like you and Abe, for example. So was that accurate? Was he that sort of a player at this point?
I think he started out. I think him and my career is a little bit similar. You started out as being these star players of the team, and then you take a step back and you go into a more of a supporting role, where I was more supporting on the strategic side of things with Abe. I think it was more, Abe did the calling. He had the official badge on him, but I think we were more of a team, him and I, preparing together, talking about, what we need to work on, doing the vetoes together, all these things, and WEMP took more of like a support role, just filling out wherever, if you had a position that no one wanted to play, it was like, WEMP, I can do it. He was always the guy, dropping pistols. Back then you usually drop 2 USPs sometimes doing pistols, and he was the guy just filling out those things. So yeah, I mean, it was we took a step back for the greater good of the team, but also because we had people who were a bit more selfish, I would say, not in a bad way. I love individual highly skilled players who are star players of the team. They should be selfish to some extent, and yeah, it was just needed for what was best for the team, and I think we had a similar path in that sense.
One thing I would ask you about this lineup that went on to have so much success, as we're about to talk about, is I always made the point, this actually reminded me, this lineup, of the Astralis team. You had all the success, because it's a similar story. It's like on paper, no player even in theory is going for like the craziest stats of the game or like carrying all the stats. Like, but everyone could see like the balance of the team is incredible. People fit all of the roles you want. People clearly understand the same way to play the game. Do you think there are any similarities between mTw and Astralis?
Yeah, definitely. I think, the whole thing about, on the psychological aspect, sharing stuff, being vulnerable towards each other. We had, people crying in front of each other. When you heard about the, for example, the Polish team, there was a lot more, fights going on. And
sure.
They couldn't agree with Luke, and Luke and Taz got crazy with each other. Whatever like the stories you've heard, I have no idea whether it's true or not, but compared to how we were, we never came to that point. Obviously, we had some issues with each other, but we always dealt with them as a team. And I think that was also the thing that Kasper and Lars really wanted to implement in Astralis as well. This whole thing about, because back then in CSGO when I joined, you lost the tournament, you had 4 players coming up to a hotel room talking about how bad the 5th were, and they wanted to pick him. And it creates like an uncertainty, and
sure.
People got scared, and if they had a bad tournament, they were like, "Where are you guys? Are you on a hotel room?" And it was just really bad for the mental side of the game. And I think we were just open and honest with each other, and we dealt with whatever issues. And to some point in Astralis, which was really nice, we had players going to a second player talking about how bad the third player was. That was like happening sometimes, and whenever it happened, you had the player saying, "Why are you saying that to me?" You should go to the player directly, and experiencing that and seeing that development. That's crazy, throughout 16. That was really cool to see, and that created this unity around the group. And I think maybe that is one of my traits, I would say, one of my actually strengths. It's not about, yes, of course, you can talk about the whole utility thing in Astralis. You can't create something like that every time. But I think my strength is definitely creating that unity around the players, where they all felt like this openness and coming together and creating that bond around the players. And I also felt like we had that in We had that in mTw, we had that in Astralis, and I also felt it. I felt it even more present, I would say, in Vitality. The way that we worked there as well, especially in 23. So yeah, it was just there was a lot of similarities to mTw and Astralis. Also with the whole thing, yes, we had device, but it was more around the team. You know,
yes.
The teams comes first. Everyone is equal. Also outside of the game, I've always tried to not have favorites. I would say I was more, my favorites would always be the young and inexperienced guys. The ones who needed the attention the most. But I've always tried to treat people fairly and not, sugarcoat device or talking him up and all these things. I've always tried to treat everyone equally.
I have a quick question though, which is when this lineup was made with WEMP, and at the time it was a big blockbuster move, like he was top team, obviously being in these major finals, everyone knew WEMP, he was a legendary player. The funny thing is though, do you remember one of the first tournaments though, it looked like it was going to be terrible, bro. You remember this one I'm talking about? It's where you went to the SEC and you played that team, that European Championship basically, guys, and they lost to a team from Greece. And by the way, it's not like, Greece was good back then. No one even knew the team back then. Like, there were nobodies. Like, what? This made it seem like this lineup was going to be terrible. What happened?
Yes. So we played this Greek team on Dust 2, I remember. And we just got hard countered from first round to the last. They really prepared. And back then it was really rare to go up against teams who prepared. We got demolished. And I remember also WEMP playing in on Nuke against Attacks. I think that was the final team we lost to late on. We then came back and won a bunch of games. And then we played, Nuke against Attacks. And I think WEMP had a horrible game. He was not paying attention. He was, getting spammed through the walls. I think he maybe did a TK as well. It was just a really poor game from him. And I remember, the Danish teams was like, everyone was supporting HBX.
Right. They were taking sides, I see, right.
Yes, because that it was the wrong decision. And how could they do this? And WEMP is washed and whatever they could, come up with. And it was a horrible start, but we definitely came back and proved them wrong, I would say.
Yes. No, I mean, that's the funny thing, because basically right after this, like a few months later, it was when you had an amazing summer and like you were winning the events. And people don't know at the time, the previous year, at the end of the year, FNATIC, the Swedes, were actually #1 and you guys were beating them all the time this summer. Like, do you remember what it was like to actually be like, because let's be real, this is the first time you're actually properly in the #1 team in the world, right? Like at that time, if you attend an event, you should think you should win it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a really good run. I remember, I think it was in the beginning of 2008. I think WEMP considered, and also MJE considered going to. Yes, it was 2008. It was actually about not to happen this whole year, because WEMP and MJE decided to start at university, and then came this whole, I think it was World Esports Masters that came in China, and then you had to go from, first we had a tournament in Dubai, and then we went to Shanghai. And then from Shanghai to Frankfurt. And just by having those 3 trips, this made them decide to let's just take one more year of playing. Okay. Just by knowing that, we can actually get to travel to Dubai, Shanghai, and Cologne. And then everyone just started grinding, and no one was in school, because at some point, even though in mTw people had part-time, even part-time jobs, with HBX, he was supposed to go to the military. He refused, and when you refuse in Denmark, unless you can draw a random number, and if you get unlucky, you will have to go. And if you don't want to go, then you'll be forced to work for the government in some sense. So he had that work. I think MJE had his last year of high school, and then that's what was the reason why he wanted to go to the university. So we had but this time around everyone could just play Counter-Strike full time. So we had a lot of boot camps, and we were playing a lot, and really enjoying spending time together. Boot camp for several weeks, doing stuff together outside of the game, just like we did in Astralis as well. And yeah, it was a year where everything came together. Now we have tried for 2007, where it was tough, almost made it. Then we made this one switch, had a bad start, but then we started figuring stuff out, and people playing more and just grinding. But it was a tough year. But I remember 2008. That was not. I think that was the whole DSN Archie lineup with FNATIC. I think Gux and Getway came.
Yeah, that was the next year.
Yeah, that was next year. Yeah, So it was probably the game against, the Polish guys and still FNATIC though.
By the way, obviously another thing that was quite pivotal about mTw becoming number one was you guys were a proper tactical team that was trying to do study the demos and have an approach. If people don't know back then, I mean, it's funny because it's kind of in vogue again in Counter-Strike now, but a lot of the teams I would say were more like what FaZe Clan is now. It was the Swedish teams were all just really skilled players who just defaulted every round and just tried to shoot everyone in the head basically. So at the time I actually thought it was kind of a big deal that a proper tactical team took over the game, because if anyone goes back and looks at the results of this team, it's like the modern day Astralis team you had is very consistent. If you don't win the tournament, you're in the semi-final. If you lose the final, it's probably 3 maps. It's probably 13-11 or 16-14. It was always very, very close games. So do you think your approach was different to other teams? Were you ahead of the meta in that sense?
I think we were ahead in the meta of the teams back then. I mean, I don't think a lot of teams, they studied that much. I mean, we had not all players, but we were definitely sitting a big group of players, preparing me and Ave and then talking it through with the players. We spent a lot of time in theory crafting, coming up with new stuff. I wouldn't say evaluating our practice like we do now in CS2/CSGO, but we definitely put a lot of time and effort into minimizing our mistakes and making sure that the things that we practiced was also the things that we did in official. Criticize the players if they went too much out of the system, playing by themselves. Try to optimize communication all the time and all these things. So I think, without knowing, but I don't think a lot of the other teams were in front there.
Another thing is, you referenced it earlier, but the interesting detail about this year was the player that everyone wanted to vote player of the year was obviously Sunde from your team, the AWPer. But the weird thing was he wasn't an AWPer. I even remember watching him play in the past teams SOA or whatever, where he was just a rifle player. And if you ever watched him use the AWP, look, Device did become a proper AWP and put a lot of years in it. But I always said there was also a weird similarity there, which is these aren't guys where it's they just some of the big ego AWPers that I'm just going here and then I kill 3 people. It's everything they do, it looks like it's within the context of what is the team trying to do and what are we doing here and what did we prepare for? Because I noticed even back then, if you ever watched Sunde on CT side, he wasn't like the AWPer that just sat at the corner and tries to kill all the people. He would kill one person here, then drop back, and someone's obviously made a call, he's going to rotate to this site. And then all the other players who were the SK players told me the problem was essentially when he peaked on T side, you never knew where he was going to be. He might be on this corner, he might be on the totally other site. Was there a conscious effort of how to use this AWPer? And because like I said, to me, that was very unusual for how you use star players back then.
I think it was definitely a talking point for us, but it was not as clear as it is in CS nowadays. I think we really tried. I also tried a lot with together with Apex and Matt. To force Saiwu to move around more, and I think I didn't have to do that much of a job when it came to Device because he was so skilled in that department himself. But yes, it was definitely something where it was us playing for him. So he would definitely move around. I can't remember, specific talking about it, but it was definitely something that we were more aware of because, as you said, I mean, a lot of the AWPers, they were just holding a position. AWP was, depending on where he was spawning on, let's just keep it with train, either going, mid, connector to hold team main if he had a good spawn, or just standing around, the bomb train, and then occasionally he would go Ivy and take a peek. But I remember Sunde being, could go inner, take a peek from there and, move around the map, getting a kill and then moving back, and then us adapting to it. But can't remember if it was a clear part of our strategy more than it was just, maybe something that he wanted or we talked about, and then it was just a natural thing for us to just adapt whenever he decided to move.
When the next year, like you referenced, the FNATIC made the super team of Gux and Get Right and Forest, which even at the time, if people don't know, seemed unfair. On paper, those were already amazing players. And then the worst thing is it worked. In the server, they really did shoot everyone. I remember doing an interview with Ave at the end of 1.6 where he had an interesting theory where he actually sort of said something along the lines of that in theory, their style was like the hard counter to your guys' style. Because since you did the proper tactical build-up, he said what would happen is just as you were about, because of the old meta was the counter counter flash meta. He said he'd be like holding a counter flash, and then they just wouldn't even peek with a flash. They would just have one of these like sick aimers, just like basically in the modern day, everyone knows like Ferrari peek in and just shoot you in the head, and you're like, the fuck, what are we supposed to do with that? Like, do you remember this? Does this sound accurate? 'Cause at the time, if people remember, they beat everyone, but they also did beat you guys. It seemed like every time out the gate, you know.
Yeah, I remember the FNATIC was definitely one of the harder teams to counter, you know. In some sense, I remember back then I wasn't a big fan of cArn as an IGL because for me, you know, being this structured APC way of playing Counter-Strike, you felt everyone, and especially like a team like FNATIC, it's just random. They're just relying on the individuals.
If people don't know, the meme back in the day really was that it was cArn who said Forest go kill, not the Carrigan says Nico. That's actually a modern day meme of the cArn one from back in the day. You're right, yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And for me, I hated cArn. I thought he was super overrated, and he was not, you know, such a bad IGL. What is this call, and why is he doing that, and why are they not going, as you said, without flash and he just worked really well with the tools that he had, and for him to play the Danish way, that would probably have limited a player like Forest or Get Right. So they needed that kind of freedom. But in theory, he's like in hindsight, it was the right approach, definitely. But for me, coming from this, you know, highly tactical way of seeing the game, it was really annoying to play against because you couldn't just, you know. I wouldn't say we didn't have all the tools that we have nowadays, so we had to, you know, download the demo, run it through. You couldn't really go back and forth like we can today. So if you fucked up, you had to, you know, probably restart the demo at some point, and it was just a mess, and on a shitty laptop, by the way, because we didn't have a practice room. So it was just tough because you couldn't really. It was difficult seeing patterns within their playstyle because they switched up so much and didn't have like set executes or anything where you could know, okay, they do this set executes if they pop up door this, because back then timings as well was just spot on. At 1:42 they might do this, and if they don't, they're not gonna go here. And it was just so easy to see. Also in the beginning of my CSGO career as a coach, but even more clearly in 1.6, and that was just difficult with FNATIC. You couldn't really get those tells. You had to look at them more individually, and just seeing their positions, and then you just. I mean, I remember telling the guys, and also, you know, me and Ave, that if we want to beat them, we need to show up individually as well, because tactically it was not enough.
By the way, this will sound like a weird question, but because I'm remembering what it was like in the scene back then, I want to ask you, which goes like this. Since you guys were actually one of the rare teams, like you say, watching the demos together, not just the IGL does it, or like trying to figure out what our game plan is, did you ever get the vibe that other teams thought you were like tryhards? Like I remember famously when I worked in SK Gaming and we had Get Right, he did that stupid line where, maybe it was when he was in FNATIC, when he was like, what's on that laptop or something, Dave? And I was like, well, the demos obviously. Like, what are you talking about, Get Right? Like, that's a good thing to prepare and know what they're going to do. But at the time, you know what it was like, because there wasn't much money, some players did almost want to like seem like they were rock and roll stars, you know, like they would like play the game, but then they made it sound like they never practiced and they just turned up and, you know, like rolled out of bed and won the game. Like, did you ever get a vibe that people thought you guys were tryhards or you were going too nerdy?
To some extent, yes, but I think also a little bit like with Astralis, I think we were a very close team. We didn't really socialize that much with the rest of the community or the rest of the teams. I remember Sunde, he had some friends over at the Polish teams, were friends with Taz and those guys, but also with DSN. But for the rest of us, it was not that much. I mean, we just tried to stay in the bubble and just, you know, prepared and did our thing. And yes, we were definitely tryharding, but you know, Counter-Strike was our life. We didn't even, you know, we didn't play for the money. There was no money.
Sure.
It was just to, you know, explore the world and being competitive. And I remember when I retired in 2012 and started on my university, it was a horrible time because I needed this, you know, competition element in my life, and I couldn't really get it, and I couldn't, you know, transition that. That would have been perfect if I just transitioned that into, you know, my studies. But it was very difficult, you know, preparing for those compared to, you know, playing and traveling together with friends and just enjoying, you know, that whole competition. That was a big part of your life for several years.
By the way, I know that famously one of the reasons why mTw, the team, ended later was like financial problems with the org and not getting paid and stuff. If people don't know, that was more common than people know. Like, for example, when I worked at SK, it's not that we didn't ever get paid, Zonic. It was more like you just didn't know when you would get paid. That was the problem. So it's like, you might get it this month like normal, or it might just be like 3 months and then you get it all suddenly enough, which in itself makes it hard. Like obviously in that scenario, you have to sort of plan ahead what you can do with your rent or when you're going to go on holiday or pay for a car or something. Was there actually, before the end, were there problems in MTW in that sense? Did you also have similar issues of when do you get paid? Or I know for some of the events just never paid the prize money, right?
Yeah, we never received our prize money from Code 5. I think we received some of them. But yeah, that was a normal day in life. Like you never really knew if you got your salary in time. I think MTW were one of the better organizations, but towards the end it was very difficult. And I think we all got our money from MTW.
Oh, okay.
So it was maybe there was some prize money, I can't remember, but yeah, it was never on time, always a couple of days late. So you really need to make sure that you had money on your account when the month was coming to an end, because you couldn't really rely on whenever the bills were coming that you also got your paycheck, and sometimes you had to poke them once in a while just to say, hey, remember, it's the first on Monday, so you better start sending my salary. But yeah, it was tough. But I also think at some point we were kind of relying on our prize money. I was living with my wife. We were not earning that much money, and it was just difficult making a living, having your own apartment, and then just having to rely on, because sometimes I also brought her to tournaments.
Oh, sure.
And that was difficult, to finance that with almost no salary, to be fair. So it was a tough time, but I also look back at it with a lot of pride, and when I see all these young guns today and talking about how bad the breakfast is at the hotel.
Of course, yeah.
It makes you laugh. And also went to pre-says, back in the days, in 2013, I'm like, bro, back in the days, it's just, they have no idea.
No.
I remember there was one ESL tournament, it was all these big Cebit messe thing where you were playing with your own headset in front of, 10,000 people in a I don't know how many square meters, but and then you have this Razer booth next to your scene, and it was just going 1, 2, 3 Razer, and everyone is just shouting, and you're playing your game, your semifinal, and you're rushing outside on you because people can't hear shit.
Yeah.
And I remember when we went to one of these tournaments, we had to stay there for, I think we flew down there. It was one of the first tournaments where ESL paid, or maybe MTW paid. I can't remember. 2 hours away from the messe. We were living in a hostel. There was no hotel room. It was just a big hall where we were sharing rooms with 12 Polish workers who woke up at 6 a.m. All took, you didn't have your own shower, so you had to share that with them. And it was just, that was crazy. And then you had to go in a 2-hour shuttle. And then you come here and you experience, Spinks or whoever it is. I mean, it hasn't happened, but complain about the breakfast or that there's not enough Coke in the fridge or whatever it is. Like the practice room is not getting refilled with snacks. I mean, it's just compared to where we came from, it's just a joke.
No, it's like obviously the famous one where even though I understand he did have the health issues, I remember when Device was saying he couldn't travel, and then it's like that was the era when they were all business class. Like, I'm just going to get a nap now, guys. Actually, like, what? I'm just thinking of the same era. And all. By the way, along those lines, so since you brought it up, I did want to ask you this question, which is, if people don't know, the girlfriend that you famously did bring to events back in 1.6 later became your wife, and you've had a whole family with her, etc. I actually wondered if back then it was very rare people ever took girlfriends to events. Like normally, like it was like if they were on the female team at ESWC, maybe they came and played, and that was like the excuse people had to meet up. But normally, even if someone did take a girl, they would normally be like more the party guys and were just like trying to be rock and roll stars. You're actually one of the only people I know brought like a proper relationship with them. Like I can imagine, I don't know if you ever could have had a relationship if you didn't back then, right? Because you're traveling nearly all the year at this time, right?
I was just so invested into the game, and it was just either we were boot camping, we were playing, but we didn't travel that much. But it was just the whole thing about we were moving in and just wanted her to also get part of. I think she had a similar or she had a similar upbringing like I had. We didn't get to travel that much. Didn't have that much money in my family. So my mom, I remember, was just super happy for me to get to see the world. And I wanted to share that with my girlfriend. I think it was just from the beginning, I just knew that this was the right one. And now we've been together for 17 years. We have 2 kids, and yeah, there was never a question in my mind that was her. And yeah, we have been together since, and I'm happy to share those, all these moments where we had to, I was depending on a tournament win, or we had to, save a lot of money just to go to South Korea, and it was just for, 6-7 days, and it was just a very important experience for our relationship, and she had a good relationship with the players as well in mTw, and yeah, it was just it was a good time.
When, to go back to the mTw period, right? One of the things I remember was, even though this team was awesome, like even when FNATIC was winning, you guys were always like semi-finals or like on the brink of winning. But at that point, they just won everything, basically. I remember the sad thing was, this is what broke the lineup up of MG and WEMP, and that's why you had to do the switch to Trace and Minute, etc. Right? It was implied from the interviews back then, they just kind of got sick of losing, right? And it was time to just go into real life things or something. Like, why did this lineup have to break up? It could have stayed together, right?
I think it's, at least from my talks with WEMP, it came down to the whole salary thing being delayed, not always coming. Okay. And then the previous year he wanted to, him and MG was considering studying, and I think it was just we had this year in 2008. We started losing a little bit. I think they had to make their decision in July, so at least 4 or 5 months of losing. But also with the salary not coming in on time, and them just feeling okay now. Maybe they were a bit full. They accomplished what they could. We won World Cyber Games, won ESWC, not the big one, but won the one in Paris. They had a Masters version, yes, I think, in Paris. And yeah, I think it was just they were just like, okay, now we did it. We played 1 more year, and now we're gonna go start studying. And that was the shift. But I remember recalling WEMP at some point saying that it was just annoying for him not to rely on the salary, and I think he also had a girlfriend, and he was not like with me just to bring her along. It was more like now he was just tired of playing CS. And again, the whole thing, Danish Counter-Strike players and summer coming up. I mean, why not retire?
By the way, as I alluded to earlier, I don't think people know how young this guy was, because like at the time he retires, at this point we're talking about, I think he's only like 20, 22 or something ridiculous. Like if I mean, no one knew how big CSGO obviously would be, but like he could have just stayed and played CSGO if he wanted. Like he'd probably had years to go, right?
Yes, I remember hearing his name for the first time. I can't remember if it was Titans, the Titans, with, I think he was 12 or 13 when he started, showing insane skills. But he couldn't travel that much because of, the laws in the law in the US.
Oh, right. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, true. You had to be 17 or something, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes.
So that was a bit unlucky for him.
Right. Obviously, though, the good side is that did mean there was a chance to bring Trace into the team. And if people don't know, like anyone who had eyes already knew this guy was insanely skilled at the game. But at the time, I mean, I know he hates this to be brought up, but it was what everyone said. At the time, people it was kind of like simple. Everyone was just like, he's just toxic, though. You don't want him, though. He's toxic. Do you remember this time period? Like, because I always wondered, your team seems like a very different vibe to that. So was it easy to integrate him? Did he have any issues?
I don't think it was easy to integrate Martin. I think he was obviously his skills. Speaks for himself. I mean, he was extremely good, and we all immediately acknowledged that he is like at one point here you could talk about having a star player on the team, like significantly, where you would wanted to feed him and make sure he was in a good spot, in a good position, because he was extremely talented. I wouldn't call him toxic, but I think what was the problem with Martin was that I think it was his way of saying stuff, giving critique, or when we were not playing that well, his way of communicating was not the best way. Also coming from, the whole mTw with WIMP and MJ, we were all sitting in a circle basically, right, and, talking, holding each other's hand, being nice towards each other. You had this bulldog coming in, speaking his mind, and I don't think we were that prepared for it. So I think it was a little bit on both sides. Sometimes it was more like us needing to man up a little bit, but also for him to maybe take a step back and just, you can say it in a more proper, nice way. But the thing is that I would say 8 or 9 out of 10 times he was right in his, in his complaints. So by the end of the day, I mean, you can't really say much to that. but his skills was definitely. It was just sometimes he got his frustrations. He was carried out like. It was a bit too much sometimes, and that could take like 5-10% off his teammates as well. And I think you also saw it a little bit with Sunde, maybe that he dropped down a little bit in level when Trace came in, and maybe that could have been handled better if you had a coach or someone who could really take that responsibility of watching that. But yeah, he was extremely good.
I always wondered, I want to ask you this, like I always said to the guys like Taz and the other Polish players, Cuban, the ones I knew, I always used to say to them, if I was you and I'm playing with Neo, it's like, yeah, Forest is sick, but we've got Neo, like we could win, he's as good. It was the same with Trace, right? Even though back then the big names with Neo, Forest, Markov, like Trace was as good as any of these guys, right?
Yes, by far. I think at some point SK also picked him up, that was like this, the big Swedish team, with Robin, Big Forest as well.
Yeah.
It was like a super team created back then, and I think it was only the language barrier that made it not work. But yeah, I think that was one of the first signs, I would say, of Denmark really having a star player. I wouldn't even call Sunde. Sunde was too good of a teammate. Coming back to the whole narrative about you need to be a bit more selfish. You need to be, Sunde could be selfish, but he needed to be a bit more, demanding more of his teammates. Being a little bit more of a diva in some sense. And I think Trace was the one who had those qualities where he could, it would be fine for him to also, be a little bit more demanding. So yeah, I think. Denmark was always a team play country where you're focusing on team play and doing the right decisions, and now we finally got a player who we could unleash to compete against the likes of Forest, Neo, get right.
Right, this is obviously the era of Ave being like arguably the best in-game leader. I mean, as you said, that's basically how like me and Lopez used to rib cArn all the time and tell him like, you're not actually better than like Ave though. You just have Forest. That's what we always used to tell him, just to fuck with him. Even though I agree with you. When I look back now, he obviously definitely did know something about how team structures work and how to use individual people that maybe wasn't about tactics. But at this time, everyone who loves tactical Counter-Strike, I mean, you remember this, if you go on YouTube to this day, they still have all those videos of all the fucking flash tactics where people are like showing them the demo of it or whatever. Like some of them are insane. Like some of these, like my comparison would be if people know the sport, like synchronized swimming, where you have to swim exactly the same. Like it's really complicated. Like it sounds like in this era, not only did you guys put a lot of time in, but like you had to, I mean, I'm going to ask you the question. Sounds like Ave had a very like set idea of how to play CS, right? Did he have a vision of what the game should be?
Yes, definitely. I mean, he was always very calm, but I also think that me and also MJE really pushed him and challenged him sometimes. Because I remember that he was sometimes too good, and then MJE would be, angry with him. Why are you not just saying your opinion, and why are you not doing this and that? And that kind of challenged Ave, I would say. I think he lost a little bit when MJE, decided to retire, and you got Martin, Trace coming in, and Mine as well, and to one point also ArcadioN, who was also an IGL, and maybe he just lost his motivation, but he was definitely a guy who, especially when it came to theory crafting, spending hours on finding stuff. I remember we always loved sitting at boot camps and just going in, theory crafting, coming up with new stuff, testing the timings and finding out stuff. We always spent so many hours on that, and then using our teammates to also come up with input, because I think everyone always contributed to the theory hours when we were all sitting together, but it was always me and Ave, going into theory crafts. We loved that. But he was just extremely good at analyzing his opponents, preparing for them, and then mid-round calling. It was more the rest of us. He was always like fair and open to suggestions, and it could be anyone, coming with mid-round calls. It was not just him, being this full leader where it's his word is law. It could be more some of the others taking over in that sense, but his way of seeing the games, preparing for his opponents, it was just spot on from left to right.
Along these lines, then, another thing I would ask you is, another thing that's quite silly is, another reason some of us thought cArn was overrated is because back in the day, if you ever got a POV of FNATIC, you'd sometimes see DSN right in the middle of the round, like something to do, like, we go train at Akali instead or something. So at the time, this is why it's a silly question, but I have to set it up like this. At the time, no one knew there were secondary callers, so we're all like, oh, we've got him, he's not a real IGL, look, DSN's doing it. But the joke now I realise is, you were almost certainly doing this in your team. I'm sure when Valet and Robban played together, one of them did it if the other one was the IGL. Like, I think people actually also, even in the modern day, put too much on the in-game leader dude. Like, they talk about Carrigan now as though he's supposed to make like every call in the whole game. Like, they make it sound like he's playing StarCraft, like, he obviously has to still take info from Rops' lurker and Broke if he's going in. Like, what would you say in this, like, what was the setup of MTW like in that regard? Like, if you wanted to make calls, you made calls in these games too, and you were watching the demos as well, right?
Yes, and also sometimes freeze time calls. And I remember,
right.
I think it was I think it was World Cyber Games 2010. I think it was like we were super frustrated because Ave just wanted to go inner against, I think it was against Navi. He just kept going inner, and it was just, bro, we can't go in anymore. And it was just one of those times where that was one of the few times where Ave was stubborn. He would always listen to his teammates as well. And sometimes he would, go against his team, but he would always be, listening. And he rarely said no. But that was the few times I can remember where he was like, no, this is the right way, we need to continue doing. And then people also respected it. Probably afterwards we have had a talk, but that's how it is. He, by the end of the day, he is the captain when it comes to us on the server. But I remember him as an IGL who had a insane vision for the game, who was fair, open to suggestions, and when it came to mid-round call, I mean, it was pretty much whoever had an idea or an info. Nowadays we talk a lot when it comes to CS. The flanks needs to count the smoke. So the guy outside of B Monster, he needs to call his teammates over from A if he knows that they have used 3 smokes and there's 1 minute and 20 left, and then he's the one setting up the attack on B because he has the most knowledge, and then the Ingrid is just supporting him. We also work like that in Vitality. I mean, if it's Spinks calling for B, it's not going to be Apex suddenly talking about how we should attack B. It should have to come from Spinks because he's the guy who has, obviously from the preparation, had more specific knowledge about how they play. He has all the knowledge from this specific round, and he's the guy having the best idea about how to go in on B. So I think in-game leaders nowadays rely more on getting these infos, and they cannot just call all the time. And you need more input from your teammates as well.
Right, one thing I've always thought is bizarre is, there's like a famous saying that people have had, I forget if it was actually a famous person who said it, but people will know the quote when I say it, where they say like, you shouldn't call a match a rivalry if one side just wins every time, basically, which is like, it's not technically true, like you are still contesting the thing, but I get the sentiment. Essentially, like, if I beat you all the time, it's not like you can really talk shit, is it? Like, I'm winning every time. Yeah, we're rivals in a way, but I always win. So, obviously, people will know in 1.6, one of the most famous versions of that was Na'Vi versus MTW when this team came along. So, whereas, like, the difference on the past years was you had a year where you were awesome and FNATIC had a year where they, and it's a bit back and forth, This was one where it felt like, on paper, aside from individual maps, they did win every single match. And even the way it began is almost like something out of a fucking movie or something. Like, if you remember, it was when they hadn't even become Na'Vi, when they were cursing it at that first IEM. And the map was Train, and this is like the story of the entire rivalry, because Train was always the map they beat you on. And it was even the one where, like, they did the insane comeback after, like, you were up, seemingly had won the map already. And that was, if people don't know, that was basically the story of this matchup all throughout the year. What do you think was so tricky about them specifically for you? Because I notice you guys could beat FNATIC if you played them, or SK or someone. And it's like, if any of those teams ever just beat Na'Vi, you could have won some of these events, but every time that one team just counted you somehow.
Kind of felt like Liquid against Astralis, I guess, in 18. For me, it was just, to some extent, I've just, completely blocked it out of my memory. I just remember no matter what we did, and we tried every single time we went up against them, we tried, to crack the code. And it just seemed like, even if we came close, there was the last bit of luck that just, Markelov went crazy. Or if we managed to get it to overtime, then suddenly Starix out of nowhere just became a super guard in those overtimes. And it was just, no matter what we did, and no matter how close it got, it just fell out to their advantage, and there was nothing that we can do. And yeah, it's just to this day, I don't really think we could have done anything differently. We tried our best with what we had, but it was just never enough. And I'm actually not sure how many games it was, but it was, at least when you're counting maps, because it was, as you said, it was always, in a grand final, semi-final, or whatever. If we managed to get into them, run into them, we knew it was going to be 3 maps, most likely, and we were going to lose in the end. And if we didn't meet them, then we were going to go straight to the final. And kind of what Liquid also went through. And it was really tough, also mentally. And especially because I think the World Cyber Games, that was the only time where I actually felt this was
thought you had them, right?
Yes, we had them at that time, but we fucked up the last couple of rounds on train, if I remember correctly.
Because one thing I did want to ask you about, it's a very difficult question to ask, because unfortunately Zeus, who was the in-game leader in Na'Vi, if people don't know, even back in 1.6, is just such a bigger-than-life figure, and people know him for like silly jokes, or they've seen him like seems like really harsh or whatever. And so I've always found it a bit weird, because on one level, like when I look at some of his teams, like even think how many years in CSGO he was an in-game leader, like his teams have all been very good, and they're all pretty consistently quite good as well. So you clearly can't just be like this weird, wacky, like idiot guy. He obviously has some mind for the game, but when I remember watching the demos back then, it was really hard to figure out like what was actually a call, and like what you say, what was like an individual player doing something brilliant. Like, did you feel as though Na'Vi had like a special style against you, or did like I've heard maybe they made like calls on the fly or something in these games? Something. What do you think the strength of Zeus was in 1.6?
I think it's difficult if I have to come up with an answer, because I can't really, to be honest, I can't really remember all those games. Enough. I mean, it was just, I can't remember how they played, but I would guess it was a little bit more like how you see a lot of the CIS teams, except for Spirit, is playing CS2 or CSGO nowadays. It's not really that tactical heavy. It's more, sneaking around, making sure you're able to trade. You throw your smokes, you wait a little bit. You don't, in all my time we have been playing, if you smoke CT on Inferno, you need to go there before it evaporates, before it goes away. Otherwise, you can be shot from CT. You can, run into a crossfire. But those guys were just a little bit more patient. And then on the CT side, when you were playing against that, you are kind of afraid that is it a fake? They just threw all their nades, but they're not coming. And they were just extremely patient, I would say. If I remember correctly, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think it was just this more, Russian style, a little bit loose, a little bit slow.
Fair enough.
Nothing too fancy, no set executes really. Just playing along each other, using each other, good spacing, all these things.
Right, no judgment in this question. Do you think Na'Vi is the best 1.6 team ever?
Nah, I think it's obviously if you look at me like being destroyed by them for the entire year,
sure.
I think it's definitely one of them. But I remember they also lost to some other teams. I mean, it was just us they destroyed, right? They lost occasionally, or did they just dominate everyone? I think they
did win a lot, but they also would lose to FNATIC sometimes, for example. Yeah, the Poles beat them a few times.
Yeah, I don't know. If you look at the entire, circle, you also have to consider the Poles. I mean, they were really consistent from, what was it? Was it 2006? 5, I think. 5 they started. I think 6 they won. Did they win the World Cyber Games?
Yeah, that's 2006 they won. Yeah, the one
they won. Yeah, but I remember they destroyed, the Danish, Titans in 2005. Neo doing the ace from Absent.
Oh, true.
That was the first time where you were like, wow. Those guys are good. They were always there, and for me, I think I've always been a big fan of consistency. They also had the year in 2007. Now we had the year, but if you look at the whole span, I think you have to consider the Poles as well.
By the way, since you brought it up yourself, because I think actually in your career, you have one of the craziest ones I've seen for the parallels. Like I say, the mTw Astralis ones, but I think that one is crazy. The fact that you yourself were on the wrong side of one of the worst one-sided rivalries ever, and then as a coach, you were on the good side of it. Like, you were the guy when, look at that. Like, by the way, the same story you're telling me now, this is like the story I've had a million times with like Zeus, Elise, like like every time, what's the new approach? What are we going to do this time? Oh, we should switch our veto. We're going to do this. Every time come with a new plan, they just lose every time. Part of you must have felt like, I know what this is like. I've been on the other side of this, right?
Yes, definitely. I felt so bad. I really tried to, always was nice to them. Even if they had, their period, they started winning in 19, where we really, we had 2 players who were struggling, to keep up on the mental side, and it was just we had to, completely take a step back, and Liquid exploited that, winning the Grand Slam in 64 days or something, and then coming into the major where we then came, full rested and well prepared. And I remember they were talking, a lot of shit, to be honest, the Liquid guys. But they were just confident and confident, and you can understand, their happiness for finally becoming the number one team, and they felt that now it was their time. But I've winning against them in Berlin, that was just I've just felt like you could have said a lot of things, and be against them, but it was just I felt for them because I tried it myself.
And then, obviously, one of the interesting things was, at the time period when Na'Vi stopped winning everything, was when another move you guys had done, like you said, was he brought ArcadioN in. And a lot of people actually forget this detail. They forget that ArcadioN eventually became the in-game leader, right? Then Ave was like a secondary core or something. So how did that work within the team? Because you had them both at the same time, if people don't know.
I think it was a big mess, to be honest. Nothing against ArcadioN. I think he did well, but... we kind of got divided in some sense. You had me and Ave, and then you had the other 3. I think it was Mine, Trace, and ArcadioN. Also because those 3, they knew each other from a previous team.
Oh, they used to play before, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and it was just the whole thing that we have been working on just got lost in some sense with the whole us being a team, a bubble. No one's fault, really. I think, again, we just needed a proper coach. We didn't have a coach back then. I felt like it was a big mess. I think he wanted to retire numerous times, but we couldn't find a replacement. We wanted Friis, the Danish AWPer. He decided to go to FNATIC instead. And then, it was a big mess. We couldn't find a good replacement. Ave wanted to retire, then we had to ask him to come back, and it was just also at that time. I remember, the mTw hit, big financial issues.
Right,
they couldn't pay the salary, and at that time I felt that it was like a couple of months, and I think eventually we got told that mTw would shut down, and then I joined mousesports. So it was a tough period.
By the way, one thing as well around this time period that I wanted to ask about is, I've noticed from the way you're answering and the way you're talking about the strengths of these teams in 1.6 that you had, one thing I feel like as an outsider that we all do is we just look at it like it's like sports and soccer where it's like, oh, just put this guy in who scores 8 goals over the guy who scores 4 and then we'll have more up front or something. But you don't think about how the team operates, whereas it sounds like one thing you guys really valued, and as far as I know, actually, this is something cArn and the FNATIC guys cared about a lot more. Whereas teams like SK would just, like, they would literally just, if you have a bad tournament, cut you and then recruit like the guy who's at the top of the scoreboard in the other match, like a qualifier, and they just made all-star teams over and over and over and over again. But I noticed in your teams, it feels like you cared more about like the group dynamic to some degree, and like you're saying, whether people are like bought into the same approach. It's not just as simple as like, oh, this guy's fragging out, so let's get him in the team. If you do that, it's a gamble. You can blow everything, right?
Yes, I've always, not been a big fan of changing players in general. When you have something, you work on your problems, you sit down, you talk, and you fix your issues. Because I think every time obviously it's unavoidable to make changes. And I also felt like I had to do it in Vitality because I wanted to, build the team for the future. But I think for me, it's always been, I always seen it as whatever issues you have, and maybe that comes from my upbringing. I mean, you need to fix your problems and try and work your way out. Because if you change a player, you just have to start all over. In the way that we work, and essentially, even though you're just changing one player, it's an entire new team. 2 friends who were really good friends, and another guy is leaving, then another one comes in, and those 2 friends can be challenged because then one guy is suddenly liking the new guy, and it's just, it's just you really need to make sure it's the right decision before you change a player. And even though I've been when we talked with about Dupree, I was considering benching him in Astralis as well, because he had so many issues outside of the game. And to one point it was just, I've had so many talks with you and now you really need to fix it. And it was just, at the end he fixed it, and yeah, and here we are. And yeah, I've never been a fan of just changing just to change, even though there are some positive things. You get a fresh start, you get a new player in, the motivation will rise, and then you can maybe go on a big wave. You maybe solve some issues, but I think whatever changes I have made, except for the Falcons one so far, has always been with a lot of time, evaluating the whole situation, trying my best to work with the player around improving, fixing the issues if there's an issue between two players, before I have made the decision to cut a player. And that was also when I was a player. I was never a big fan of just changing players just to change.
Right. One of the weird things about you guys in your careers is no one really ever did used to say mTw with chokers, even though you lost to Navi, because if you think about the order of things, you had the 2008 where you won everything and you were still really good. So I think because you'd won, people didn't do that as much. But if you look at the last few years, there's a million times you're in a semi-final or a final, but there's not many trophies. There's like one or two and they're really spread out. Do you regret that, the way the last years of 1.6 went? Could it have been different? Is there anything now that would have changed it? Because like I say, it's like you were always this close, it felt like.
I think it was just not the same. Not saying that our motivation was any different or that we didn't, enjoy playing. Maybe the enjoyment part was a little bit missing. I'd never felt we had a very unique team, I would say, in 2008, and that kind of got lost. But I think my ego and my competitive gene would just go up against that, and then I would continue playing. And even in my time in mousesports, I think that is probably the only time where I felt a little bit like, okay, maybe it is time to actually, consider retiring. Because I maybe wasn't at 100%, motivational wise, but I just felt like it was just a team, falling a little bit apart. You had your star player in Sunde falling off a little bit with his level. You had, a little bit more arguments, a little bit more talking behind people's back. It was not as clean as it was in 8, and that was just, I kind of see it a little bit as if you it's very hard if you suddenly make a lot of money to then go back and have no money compared to when you had no money to begin with. I think that's a little bit the same thing here. When you had such a good relationship with your players, that can really test your motivation and your dedication if you then go into a team where you don't have that anymore. Not to say anything good about myself, but I think I was one of the only guys who just kept, grinding and working hard. And I think some of the others got a little bit lost motivational wise.
I may not have the most supporters in the world, but the ones I do have are straight fire. And they include Matt Pugnaccio Rakula, Frisky, Ahmed Haju, Toucan, Tobias Bernasconi, Animosity, Tosh, Jensen Gore, and you know it always is a special thanks going out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my show? Do you want to see things I say on my Discord, little piece of straight fire I drop in the Patreon only channels, stories I tell people in the other ones? Do you want to ask a question in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out who the next guests are for reflections interviews? Maybe you want to be one of those people who takes part in the long form discussion with me where we talk about whatever's on your mind in esports. Well, if any of those or more sound interesting, why not support me, put your money where your mouth is, and join the Illuminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.